Hi, Jacinda. Welcome. Are you there? Okay, I'm going to give her a minute to work on her audio portion.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, now I can hear you. Hi.
Hi, can you see me?
I can't see you, but I'm going to turn on your video
Okay.
okay. And I invited you on video as well.
Okay.
So let me try it again. You'll have to accept once I hit that. Invite
Okay.
to video. Okay, I just invited you.
There. Yay. Yay. There we go. Nice to meet you. Meet you,
You
Susan.
too. You too. Okay, just waiting for your video to come up. Did you see the invite we sent?
It was so pretty. I shared it all on. Yes. Oh, here we go.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Oh, there she
Yay.
is. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. Welcome. All right. As our guests are trickling in, we're going to go ahead and get started. We like to be punctual. So, hello, Firesiders, and welcome to Adventures by the Book, where our mission is to connect people and community through the power and magic of books. I'm your host, Susan Macbeth, and I'm delighted to be hosting today award winning author Jacinda Townsend to talk about her new book, Mother Country. And welcome to those of you who are listening in our virtual audience below, and also who are listening live on our public profile page on Fireside, and who are tuning in live to any of our social media channels. We welcome all of you. For those of you who are in our virtual audience, you can invite yourself up on stage anytime if you'd like to chat with Jacinda or ask her questions. We will have some Q&A time at the end of our session. But if you feel a pressing question that you can't wait to have resolved, feel free to invite yourself up on stage by clicking on that little circle at the lower left-hand corner of your screen and invite yourself up on stage to speak. You can also broadcast this on your own social media channels by using that same circle and clicking the globe icon where you broadcast to the world. We want to reach as many people as possible so they can learn about this amazing, talented author, Jacinda Townsend. She is the award winning author of Saint Monkey, which has won numerous prestigious awards and prizes. She has worked as a broadcast journalist and an antitrust lawyer. She teaches in the MFA program at the University of Michigan, and she is here today to chat with me about her new novel, Mother Country. Welcome, Jacinda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I was following your whole Iceland adventure and it looked just amazing. Have you come down from that yet, or you must still be tingling?
Well, you know how it is on vacation as you come down pretty much the minute you get home to laundry and hundreds of emails and work behind. But yes, the glow will stay with me for a long time. Have you been before?
No, I wish. No, I really want to go.
Well,
It,
I went to the Icelandic Writers Retreat, which you would be an amazing instructor for. You should look into that. And I actually learned about it through Fireside, our program on Fireside. I was interviewing the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid, for her book. And she was telling me about the retreat. And this was in February. And she said the retreat had been virtual for the last 2 years because of COVID, but it was coming back in April in person. And I said, oh my gosh, that's only like 3 months away, but I've always wanted to go. So we just signed up and went on a whim, and it was amazing.
that's so, that's fair.
Yeah, I hope you get a chance to do that someday. But before we talk to you about your book, let's kind of go back a little bit in time and talk about your early interest in books and writing and your trajectory into where you are today as accomplished writer. So I'm curious about how your passion for books and writing came about. Was there a family member or a teacher or some other experience that motivated and encouraged you in that direction?
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to my mom. My mom was an early reading specialist. That was one of the things she did in life, and so she taught me how to read at a really early age, which was really fortuitous because I was an only child and I grew up in a really rural area. And so, the two things I did were lie out in the field and watch the planes go overhead and also read books. And so I read and read. And I think, part of, and this may be sort of a subconscious impetus behind Mother Country, is that part of why I read was that I felt like I was growing up in this little tiny town in rural Kentucky, and I kept reading about other worlds. One of my favorite books was it followed these three children. One lived in Saudi Arabia, one lived in Poland, one lived in Mexico. And I just read it over and over again. And I love the ability of a book to just remove you from wherever you are and place you right there. So that's, and then I did, I went to law school. I never lost my love of reading, but I thought I had to go to law school like many people. And then I got there and I was so lucky because I cross registered in the English department and cross registered for some fiction workshops. And I published many of the stories I wrote during that time. And so I thought, I think I'll make a life out of this. So, I did practice law for a while. I was a journalist for a while at Court TV and CNBC, but never really that love of writing and reading never left me. So a few years after I started living in New York City, I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop and I got in and I went. And from then on, life just turned kind of magical with this writing thing. So here I am now. And I'm just very pleased. So
Well, we are too. Us readers are very pleased that you chose that path as well. I know in a previous life I was a paralegal, and so I was around lawyers all day. And uh, at one point, everyone asked me, "Why aren't you going to law school?" And I thought, "Oh my God, no! This is a job to pay the bills. There is no way I want to become an attorney." And like you, I was, driven to read and to write and to travel, and there's nothing like it. And law is not it, at least not for me. And it sounds like not for you either. But then you grew up, you became a broadcast journalist. As you mentioned, you went to law school, became an antitrust lawyer. So has your professional attuning to current events and social justice issues influenced your writing? And if so, how? Can you elaborate on that a bit and tell us about that?
sure, sure. Well, I have always believed that, one of the things that artists do as a matter of profession, it's like one of our requirements, no matter which art you're in, writers, dancers, musicians, is we have to step out of our skins and our souls and into other people's skins and souls, and then come back and transmit that experience to the world. And that that belief that art needs to serve in that way has informed everything I do. I'm also really politically active. I was actually an elected official for a couple of years in Indiana, where we just moved from, and I just, I think that art can serve and art can do the work. So with this book, the part of it that is political has an interesting backstory. I went to I we spent when my kids were little, we spent every other summer or so in Morocco. One of those summers, I went without my kids, and I took a side trip to Mauritania. And I was doing work for Al Jazeera at the time. I was researching an article about women who worked in development. So the woman who I interviewed, who ended up being my main interviewee, worked for an organization called SOS Esclave, which in French is Save Our Slaves. She introduced me to a family of slaves who had just escaped slavery. It was probably the most powerful trip I've ever taken because I met this woman. She had just escaped slavery with 8 children. All 8 of these children had different fathers because her master had kind of leased her out. The last child, the 8th child, was the one who had been born free. She had been born in the desert on the way out. And so I got to hold this baby, and feel the most powerful vicarious feeling of like understanding what it meant for this family to have this child who was finally born free, and it was like the powerful thing was that it was kind of like touching a piece of history because throughout the ages there have been people who escaped slavery, and this is what it feels like. But then it was so disheartening that it was 2014, and there is this woman who is just now escaping slavery. So a lot of people don't know this, but 20% of the population of Mauritania is actually enslaved. And the slavery there is kind of brutal. It's people are made to do this really hard work in the desert, like herding camels. That's hard work, and they have slave children doing it. It's caste based, so it's hard to escape slavery because if you escape, you basically have no job because there it's kind of like if you're born into a family of mechanics, that's what you do. If you're born into a family of, moms, that's what you do. So if you escape slavery, there's nothing for you to do. So this woman was living on the edge of the capital city, Nouakchott. She's living in a tent. It's like 120 degrees. One of her kids was really sick. And I said, what can I do for you? And she said, just tell my story. Please just tell my story. So her story became her story, and a lot of other sort of stories I had read about escapes from slavery or life in slavery became sort of the composite backbone of Suria's story. So Suria is a woman who has recently escaped slavery in Mauritania and is in Morocco with no papers and so can't really work. But a lot of my work is informed by politics in that way. I just the novel I'm working on or revising now is about a woman whose um, father is. I don't want to give too much away, but there's a shocking incidence of police brutality, and she changes her identity and moves across the country, and it's about what happens after that. So I always kind of stick politics in, and so my background in journalism and law too has kind of informed my writing as well.
And so, without giving too much away, I know you told a little bit about the background of the book, but can you kind of tell us a little bit more about Mother Country and um, kind of in a nutshell, without because we want
Sure.
people to buy the book and to read it, right? Which, by the way, we did put a link in the fortune cookie in the middle of your screen, adventuresbythebook.com, where you can get a copy of Jacinda's book, Mother Country. So we don't want to have her give too much away because we want you to read the book, but we do want to hear what it's about as much as you can tell us.
Sure. So it's and this actually is not too much of a spoiler because the most shocking thing happens at the beginning of the book, and that is that an American woman named Shannon kidnaps a, a child. So Shannon has her own problems. I always joke she's like Lando Calrissian, right? Like she would love to help people more, but she's got her own problems. She's struggling with infertility. Her husband really wants her to have a baby. She can't. She's got, goo gobs of money in student loans. She's got medical debt. They've spent, $50,000 on IVF already. So she sees this child in the Medina and presumes that the child is unaccompanied. Later in the book, there's a lot of sort of moral question about um, what maybe was going through her head. But also, the book is about what happens to Saria both before and after her child is kidnapped and how she sort of does and does not deal with grief. Um, the ending is not happy necessarily. I think it's kind of a shocking ending. I was kind of shocked when I wrote it. But I think the book grapples with a lot of questions about what's right, what's wrong, but not only what's right and what's wrong, but what happens when you do a questionable thing, and I will say, I mean, I don't take sides in this book, because I do think both of these women are grappling with a lot, and even the American woman, she's grappling with a lot of existential angst. She is facing a multitude of like challenges, really, and I think one reason I kind of have a soft spot for her is that the way I personally entered into this subject matter is that, before I had kids, I bought into this whole cosmology that, I was going to give birth in a vat of water, and like Bambi would come out of the woods and talk to me, and it would be this beautiful thing. It was nothing like that. It was nothing like that. They were both born C-section, one of them emergency C-section after 27 hours of labor. And it took me years, Susan, to it took me, I know this sounds so weird, but it took me years to feel like their proper mother, and I just felt like I had failed at this critical moment, and every moment thereafter was going to be tainted by that. And it took me years to figure out that what makes you a good parent has nothing to do with the biology, whatever happened, but more what you do afterwards and how love becomes a verb, and that's true in any relationship, right? To love has to be a verb. But I wondered, if I spooled this out to the nth degree, how long would it take someone to feel like someone's proper mother if, in fact, they had just sort of absconded with them from another country? And so that became the backbone of Shannon's character, was that question.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so you mentioned that Saria's story, or part of it, was you didn't even know what was going to happen to her character. And so, is that something? Is that how you write? That you just allow the tale to unfold, so you don't outline, or um,
I
how do you
don't.
write books?
I don't. So on a first draft, I kind of let the characters do what they want to do. I figured they're kind of speaking to me and talking to me, and I never make an outline on the first draft because I feel like they're going to do these shocking things, and I'm just going to let them. And then, and two, I think it always takes me until the end of the first draft to really figure out what thematically I'm trying to say in the first place. So when I get to the end of that first draft, and I figure that out, I go back and I sort of remap, and I do one draft that's just for plot, like one revision that's just, it's this whole Rubik's Cube thing of, okay, if I have this ending, then this needs to be foreshadowed on page 35, and this has to happen on page 172. But my first draft is really free. And then I get to be a stickler on subsequent drafts. Uh, and I enjoy that. I enjoy the revision process so much. Do you enjoy creation or revision more?
Oh, you cut out for a second. I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, do you enjoy creation more or revision more yourself?
Oh, well, I am a novice, so I haven't had anything published. I've been working on something for a long time, but so it's always fascinating to hear writers' processes, and I find that fascinating. I love the freedom of creating first and not worrying about all the details until rounds two or more. So I like that. It clearly works for you.
Okay.
So the book has been described as a transnational feminist novel. Is that an accurate depiction of Mother Country?
Yes, I think so. I think that, as with Saint Monkey was kind of similar in the sense that I felt like I was going to tell a story in two different voices about two women facing incredibly different constraints. One of the girls in Saint Monkey is, her father kills her mother, and she has to stay. She wants to go to Hollywood and be an actress, but she has to stay back in Kentucky and take care of her little sister and basically raise her. Meanwhile, her friend gets to escape Kentucky. She's discovered playing at church by a talent agent, and she gets to go to New York, and she joins the jazz world. And it's set in the late 50s. But what really happens is they both face very different constraints. The one who stays behind in Kentucky, of course, has a very limited series of options just because she's a girl in Kentucky. But the one who gets to go to New York kind of faces the same constraints, really. She faces sort of the patriarchy in the jazz world, and actually one of the things that kind of drove me to write it is that I know the picture of A Great Day in Harlem with all those jazz greats, sitting on the steps of a brownstone. There's only 4 women in that photo, and there were tons of talented jazz musicians of that era who were women, but they just kind of were never allowed to shine, and even when they did, they weren't celebrated like the men were. So this one is kind of similar in that both of these women are really the constraints they're facing are constraints of womanhood. We have someone who's being shamed basically for infertility, someone whose husband is sort of giving her ultimatums about having children. Her career options have been limited in part because of discrimination. But then we have this woman who has basically been trafficked as a girl, from Mauritania to Morocco. She can't um, she can't work because and this often happens to migrants who are coming through Morocco. um, they can't work with no papers, and so a lot of women do have to turn to working in the sex trade. Um, so it is a feminist novel in the sense that um, a transnational feminist novel in the sense that it touches on how women do and don't overcome those circumstances. I also it was important for me to kind of they're both single mothers for most of the book, and they both kind of handle that in a way that keeps them outside the patriarchy, and that was important to me too, that they neither of them were really seeking to enter it. They both have kind of like exited the worst of it. um, so yes, I would say that is an accurate description.
And so that transnational, you write about place a lot. I mean, there's Mauritania, there's Morocco, there's Kentucky. How did you weave all these places together? And what do you know about each of these places? I mean, you
Sure.
talked a little bit already about it, but I'd love to know how you weave them all together.
Sure. And what's kind of interesting is that I grew up in Kentucky, and of all the places I've been in the world, Morocco is kind of, in some sense, the one that most resembles the culture I grew up in. People are incredibly hospitable. Everybody wants you to come to their house and eat dinner. People are very relaxed. Also, like everybody's late everywhere, so it's like pretty. It was when I got there the very first time. I was like, oh, okay, I'm home. I went for the first time actually in 2001. It was a strange coincidence that I ended up there. I was doing a Fulbright in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and the flight from Abidjan to New York City, where my then husband lives, stopped in Casablanca. So this was the old days when you could do whatever you wanted with an airplane ticket. So I decided I would extend that layover for 4 days and just get more stamps on the passport and see Morocco. So I took the Marrakesh Express from Casablanca to Marrakesh, and and um, sorry, my daughter's phone is sending me her message. I took the Marrakesh Express, and the whole time, the song was going through my head. We're on the Marrakesh Express. It was so cute. And then got to Marrakesh and discovered kind of a whole new world there too. So after I had my first child, I decided we would go back there. And one of the really fortuitous things is that living in sub-Saharan Africa and traveling in like Ivory Coast and Mali and Ghana had really prepared me for the kind of underpinnings of Moroccan culture, because Morocco is a lot of different cultures having come together. You have the indigenous Amazigh, the French, the Arabs, but there is a lot of also sub-Saharan African culture that runs through it. So I had that kind of foundation, and I also had the kind of foundation of Morocco being a relative luxury compared to where I had lived in sub-Saharan Africa. So when I started traveling with the kid, it was hard, but it wasn't that hard. But we ended up going back, every other summer, and we went to a different Moroccan city every time. We spent time on the coast. We spent time in the desert. We spent time in the in country, and it came to be a place that we really got to know. I very intentionally did not stay in hotels. We did not dine in lavish restaurants. We lived in neighborhoods so that we could get to know our neighbors. We shopped in souks so we could get to know what it's really like to live there, because that was part of it. I wasn't just researching a novel. I was kind of teaching my kids about the world. But a lot, and so eventually that did turn into this novel. It didn't start out as this novel. It started out as me just going to Morocco, but there, there were people whose stories just haunted me. Living in the Medina, getting to know people and their backstories, it turned into a thing. A lot of the novel is set in the desert. I haven't spent that much time there, but I want to play you just a little minute of Chinarowin, which is a desert band. I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about the
Yay.
Sahara.
Very good.
Can you hear? So, Chinarowin is a band from northern Mali, and there are some sides to the Sahara. There's the Mauritanian side, there's the Malian side, and there's the Moroccan side. And I like unbelievably, I've been to the Sahara from all sides now, just totally by accident. But I kind of turned into this desert rat at some point, and the Sahara is just amazing. There are it's like there are all these different cultures living in the desert. The desert is changing, actually. It's this ancient dead thing, but it's also changing a lot. Unfortunately, climate change is making it bigger, but there are still people who are living like on its edges. There are very distinct cultures there. There are people who are, when I went to Mauritania, for instance, there's only one television station in that whole country. It is state owned. The radio's all state owned. There was one ATM in the country. It wasn't working. I had no currency. I had to be chaperoned to go to the bank because I was a woman. I think I was the only woman in the bank. So it's kind of, a very, very different experience every time I went to any of these places. But I love it. And I always say too, in a lot of ways, because it was difficult to travel. It was difficult to travel as a single mom. It was difficult to travel with toddlers. My kids grew up there, but I did too. I grew up there a whole lot. I learned a lot about, a lot, including myself.
I think
So,
travel will do that for you, right?
no, yes, I
Yes.
love.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. You were saying?
Oh, I was just going to say we went to Morocco in 2019, right before COVID, on an adventure by the book trip with a Moroccan-born chef and author, and so we went all around these places that you talk about. So we were on the coast, and Marrakesh and Rabat, and I find it interesting. And I love the analogy that Kentucky is like Morocco in the sense that it's very warm and welcoming and hospitable. And we don't get that until we travel to some of these places because we have this vision in our head of what Morocco is, you know. And when you go there, it just reminds you that we're all in this together. We're all alike. We're all in this together. Um, and I love that about traveling, and I love that you were able to incorporate that in your book and your stories.
Yes, yes. It was just so much fun, and it was so much fun too to. I had this huge map, of the desert, and it was fun to sort of like chart a fantasy path that I could never do myself, But it was fun to have my character do it. Very fun.
Yeah, and I never realized. Well, I'm in California. I know you're in Indiana, Iowa, uh,
I'm in Michigan.
Michigan. Okay, yeah, but I realized that Morocco is sort of like California in shape and size, except it's horizontal, whereas California is vertical. And the geography, the cultures, everything changes so drastically wherever you are, and it's so diverse and beautiful.
Yeah, very much like California, and we lived in Northern California for a couple years, and it's like so we had snow up there, right? Whereas I think you're in San Diego,
San Diego,
right?
yes.
Yeah, so yeah, very much like that, right? And even the difference in cultures in California can be really quite a stretch, right?
Yes, it can. Well, it was interesting because I listened to a PBS interview of you, and you came across, I mean, just like you are now, very congenial and humble and warm and genuine. I'm not sure why that surprised me initially, except for the fact that when I saw your incredible achievements, I mean, you skipped 2 years in school, you graduated from Harvard, then you went to Duke Law School, you had a Fulbright Fellowship, you were a journalist, a practicing lawyer. Your first book, my God, went on to win all these incredible awards, and now you've got a second book. I just envisioned you when I was going to meet you as this very intense, driven person, and you don't come across that way at all. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about who you are at heart, what drives you, what your definition of success is, who you are as a person.
Oh, that's such a good question. Gosh. I mean, I feel like, my main thing, and it's changed over the years. I've always been a pretty easygoing person, though, actually. But I think, initially what I wanted to do, even in going to law school, was I just wanted to like serve the world in some way. I wanted to touch people. I wanted to help people. And that to me is the definition of success, and with my writing, I think one my favorite moments have been like not winning awards is great. It's I I had this really great evening where I was made to eat and drink wine, and that was amazing. But I remember most people who have written to me and said, I never thought of it this way, or I didn't know. A lot of people have written to me with this book and say, like, I can't believe that this is still going on in Mauritania, and that is really important to me. One of my most fervent wishes, and I don't know that this will happen, but that the woman, the slave who I interviewed, would know that yes, I did tell her story. That's what's important to me, and that would be my definition of success with this. And in general, I think in the last my kids are now 12 and 17, and I'll tell you this funny story. It's so when my first book came out, it was kind of a time of struggle for us in a lot of ways. I actually, somebody gave me the New York Times that when my book was reviewed in because I couldn't buy it. And then when I got it home, my kid, who was then two, threw up on it. And I thought, this is, I mean, it was a little bit of a downer, but also it made me realize, like, I as a writer, that can't be why you write. You can't write because the New York Times is going to review your book, And I always tell my students, I'm like, this for me is a job, and in some sense, if I get too excited about the success, then I have to get too dejected about the failure, and because we all know that that is an everyday part of this writing life. I mean, I tell them I can guarantee you that whatever famous writer you think of has had some sort of failure or rejection this year, and it's like I try to sort of separate my sense of self from whatever is going on with my writing, because at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day rather, I want to be able to get up and write every day and say, I've done my job, like, and whatever happens after I release it into the wild is just kind of what's going to happen with it. But I did that work today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I don't believe in failure. I think failure is an opportunity to learn, and it's only a failure if you don't take the experience and learn from it. So I think that's beautiful. I also think it's beautiful that your drive, I mean, that you've become so successful, your drive doesn't come from an intense personality or an ego that, you have to become this, idealized version of a best-selling author, but it comes from your heart and your passion and your desire to help people. And that's the reason I got into this industry, because I feel like in a very disconnected world, books connect people. And so it's that same concept, right? Is your words, your talent is helping people. You're telling stories and teaching us to be more empathetic and understanding of other people and their situations.
Yes, and I was reading something. You may have read this article too, Susan. It came out a couple of years ago, but it was the gist of it was that there are a lot of cultures who like the people they most value are the storytellers, and that's part of why is that they're the people who sort of unspool the tales that are going to touch people and inform them spiritually. And so yeah, I think what we do is just sacred work, sacred work.
I agree. And when I was in Iceland, it was amazing to me because it's a very literary culture. It's got the highest literacy rate in the world, I believe, and they really put a premium on reading and writing. And I was asking kind of about the history of it, and they said that back in days gone by, that country is enveloped in darkness much of the year. And what did they do in years way past, before they had light and candles and access to those things, is they sat there in the dark at night or even daytime when it was dark and told stories. And so they put a premium on storytelling right from the start. And so then that tradition just continued with the written word, and now it's such a valued part of their culture that they joke that almost everybody in Iceland has written a book, and I don't think that's too far from the truth.
That's very cool. Now I have to go. You've made me like
You
have to
have to
go
go,
to
but you
Iceland.
can you can be an instructor. I think you'd make an incredible instructor, and we can talk about that. I can introduce you to Eliza and talk to her about that. I think she'd love to have you. So let's see what else. Oh, I know you also talk about grief in your book, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, because I imagine that's a really hard thing to write about, to make sure that it's not too depressing for the readers, but also realistic enough that you don't water it down and you tell the truth of the story.
Yes, and I think it is as it is in real life, in that grief in storytelling has to have some air. If we are to survive, I think in real life, if we are going to get through grief, we have to find a way to put the oxygen in it. So this is a true story. I always offer this to my classes. There was a bride who had a cake that was 6 feet tall, and she had to actually get on a ladder to cut it. So she's at her wedding and she gets on the ladder to cut this cake, and the cake fell over because it turns out that's just too heavy. It's like you need more oxygen in a cake than that height was able to sustain. And I think with storytelling it's the same way. As politically hard hitting as you might want to be, there's got to be some air, and sometimes that air is simply the pushback that a character is giving the world that's trying to clobber it, and so I tried to do that as well. With Shannon it was easier, but because her grief is so her grief is there. I don't want to minimize it, but the traumas that Saria is going through are really kind of inescapable and heavy. But I tried to give her some air. She has a romantic trajectory in this book as well. There is a little bit of humor even in her situation. She her way of sort of observing the world, I think, put some air into the book, because she one of the hardest parts of writing her, this was probably the hardest thing in with either character, is that she's illiterate. So the way she sees the world is so different. A lot of what she kind of digests and wants to tell is about superstition. When she watches the moon comes up, it's totally different from me watching the moon come up. And that was really, it was hard to get into that frame of mind, of the mind of someone who didn't quite understand why things were happening a certain way at the bank, or why there's a scene where she watches this guy cleaning the street and she doesn't understand why he's emptying the garbage back out. So writing all that stuff was a way of kind of putting air into her grief, because she sees the world in this quirky, delicious way that I think is pushback to the grief. Um,
Yeah, I haven't heard that before. I like that. Air into it. And that's a good analogy with the wedding cake. So you begin the book with a quote: "People are born, they are a life, they belong to nobody." What does that refer to, and why is it significant to your story?
sure. So that this was a quote given by Joni Mitchell's biological daughter's adopted father. Joni Mitchell, as a lot of people know, put her daughter up for adoption. Her daughter's name is Kaloran Gibb. David Gibbs said that. He said that after Kaloran met Joni Mitchell, because she did meet Joni Mitchell when she was 32.
Mm.
And so one of the voices in this novel is the voice of the child who was adopted, kidnapped, whatever you want to call it. My publisher calls it kidnapped. I never called it kidnapped, but my publisher calls it kidnapped. So one of the voices is hers, and one of the choices that that voice has to make is, who is my mother? And what is that? What does it mean? Like, what does mothering mean to me? And I don't want to give too much away, but there's a trajectory about that too. And it plays a heavy part in the end, that, we don't necessarily belong to biology. We don't necessarily belong to our DNA. In some sense, we belong to the spaces that we find ourselves in. We belong to the communities that we become a part of. So that's what that quote means to me. I I I I think David Gibb probably had a different meaning after his daughter met Joni Mitchell, but that's why I put that in the front of the book.
Interesting, interesting. And I know that we still have a little bit of time, but I wanted to remind the audience that, if you want to chat with Jacinda on stage or ask her a question, feel free to invite yourself up, because obviously she's very, very accessible, very friendly, very congenial. She'd love to chat with you. But let's talk. Oh, we already have a question. Okay, hold on just a minute. Let me move my screen. From Amber, welcome, Amber. Did you have a question or comment for Jacinda?
Hi, Jacinda. It's so nice to meet you.
Hey,
Um, my question is that given that your book is about motherhood, slavery, and resilience, what perspectives or beliefs did you challenge with Mother Country? And what do you want your audience to know from reading that? Thank you.
sure. Thank you, Amber. That's such a good question. So one thing, and the book came out right before Mother's Day, which is the main holiday when we sort of elevate mothers into this sainthood that we neither really truly deserve nor want, honestly. I think I speak for a lot of moms when I say motherhood is actually this tortuous day for us because it's not it's grittier than people think, and I think that Shannon's character in sort of she wakes up one morning and there's a kid in her kitchen, and in some ways it was a choice, but it was such a sudden choice that this all been sort of foisted upon her. Like suddenly one day she's a mom to like a 3-year-old, and one of the things, the beliefs I wanted to challenge is that mothers aspire to be June Cleaver, or mothers even think that they can. I think we all know that they can't. And I actually designed the cover of Mother Country. Like, I didn't draw it, but I said I want a woman smoking this cigarette, because another thing that's not too much of a spoiler is that Shannon has a pretty raging weed habit, and it actually has something to do with the abduction of the child as well. And so, even after she gets this kid, she's not perfect. She's not even trying to be perfect. She's just trying to be a mom. And those are two incredibly different things. And one is not less valuable than the other. My imperfect mothering is no less than June Cleaver's mothering. So that's one. Yes.
Oh, I
Thank you.
love that. Thank you so much. That's so awesome to hear about the cover. And then also, I just have a comment. I really admire your background in politics and law. And I, like, for myself, I majored in political science and I really thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And life just didn't turn out that way. After I graduated college, the pandemic kind of changed a lot of things. So I just love meeting people like you that give me you inspire me to, like, okay, I'm not just boxed into one thing. I have all this future that I can go forward with. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Amber. Nice question and comment. And if anyone else wants to join us on stage, feel free. And while we are waiting to see if anyone else wants to come up, I want to talk a little bit about your debut novel, Saint Monkey, because I mean, how does it feel to write your first book and win all these prestigious awards? Can you talk a little? Yes, give her a round of applause. She deserves that. So first of all, I'd like to hear about the book itself, but I'm also curious about the follow up. Is did that put any pressure on you with your next book to produce what you just did with Saint Monkey?
Yes. So, such a good question, Susan. So, I was really surprised at the reception to Saint Monkey, and I was just there were when I won the awards, especially, I was just bowled over that I was pinching myself, and I think that my challenge then became, how do I do something completely different, actually, but still just as good? And so with this one, it was kind of like I always tell all of my novels so far, even the one I'm revising now, are told in diptych form. And what I mean by that is, like, to borrow from the visual art term, they're two different people telling the same story. I still wanted to do that because I really enjoyed, with Saint Monkey, I really enjoyed having, writing one voice one day that was telling the other person's story, and then the next day the other person was telling that person's story. And so with this one, the challenge was kind of like, okay, it's not going to be like that. But how do these two women sort of tell each other's stories and inform each other's stories? And so I think I did it completely differently this time, but it was it was very hard to think, well, maybe this book will be terrible compared to Saint Monkey because I'm trying to do something totally different. And so, and even with the book I'm working on now, it's also told in diptych. It's completely different because it's this divorcing couple kind of in some ways telling the same story, but they both have huge secrets that they're keeping from each other, and so it's a little bit it's another challenge, and I guess I like to keep challenging myself within the diptych constraint of how am I going to do that.
Well, clearly you've done it a second time, so have a feeling that it's going to keep happening. Can you divulge anything about your next book?
Sure. So, as I said, so it starts out with this woman is she's decided to get a divorce. What happens initially is that her husband's lawyer says, "Oh, well, her name isn't her name," and he's like, "What?" And she's like, "No, that's actually not my real name." And so the novel takes place, like, chronologically, it takes place over 5 days because she's in the middle of this divorce, and suddenly she just decides she's going to, like, quit her job and take her kid and go back to California, where she's from. She's from Northern California. It's a fictional town called Rosalind, but I use kind of where we were living as a model. We were living up in Davis Woodland area, and so it's about, this poor man is discovering all these things he didn't know about her, but she's also kind of traveling back through grief and beginning to understand why she changed her identity. And her identity was something she wants to resurrect by the end of the novel. She just has to grapple with grief, and it's when I wrote the first draft, I was having a lot of grief myself, and it was kind of my way of healing, because one thing I learned is that it just takes time, in this novel, it takes this woman 20 years to want to grapple with what has really happened.
Uh,
But I think grief always takes time.
yes, needs some air, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Who do you read, and which writers inspire you?
So right now I am reading Anthony Doerr,
Oh,
who I
I love him.
love. I'm reading All the Light We Cannot See, and I'm just super enjoying it.
I
Good.
love that book so much.
Good. I just and he is a perennial favorite of mine, like the that story collection, The Shell Collector's wife, or not the wife, the shell collector, right? I'm remembering that story about his wife that was so good, but um I love his use of detail, and I love the way he just talk about somebody who imagines other worlds and other souls and gets so deeply inside other people. So he's a perennial favorite of mine. I'm reading Peter Ho Davies now, and I love, like, his sort of sweeping use of history. I'm really enjoying that a lot.
Do you find, are you able to read for pleasure, or do you find as a writer that you're constantly looking for things that, tidbits of information, or, because I know as an event planner, I create multisensorial author events in Southern California, and we travel with authors, and I can't walk into a restaurant or a venue and immediately scope out, okay, how's the parking? What's the menu like? What's the ambiance? And I'm just wondering if you did it with a book. Do you pick it up and you just can't read it for pleasure because you have to dissect every bit of it?
It's an occupational hazard, right? Like, at this point, I don't, I used to write in the margins, like, I want to emulate this, and look what he did there, and look at this element, and I don't do that anymore, but it is running in the back of my head. I'm actually way worse with movies, though. Like, I can't. I know people who go to the movies with me, like, must just hate the whole experience, because I'm like, well, no, like, that plot was just all structured wrong, like, what should have, like, this should have been front loaded and things like that. But I think it's an occupational hazard that you can no longer just read a book.
And do you envision your books into movies too? Do you go there?
So I was made to do this as an exercise for an interview recently, and I had such a ball because I realized, like, oh my gosh, if Mother Country was shot on location, how cool that would be, and like who I would have as the actors and the soundtrack. So it made me do that, and I thought about that a lot with Saint Monkey too, because a lot of it does, like, there were a lot of jazz musician cameos in it, and I would, as I was writing, I would think, like, what a cool soundtrack this would be with Dave Brubeck and James Brown, and yeah,
Well, you never know what's going to happen, right?
that's true. That's true. It would, both of them would be awesome soundtracks. I know that for sure.
That would be amazing. We'd all come for sure. So you teach MFA programs around the country. I know our time is winding out, but I did want to talk a little bit about the writing, as we always have a lot of aspiring writers in our audience. Can you share, has teaching made you a better instructor? And can you offer any tips to aspiring writers that you have learned through your teaching, or also from your students that taught you?
Sure. Yeah. So the first piece of advice I want to give is something that I mean, I think it's the best advice I ever got. I got it the very first day of my MFA program. The director said, write in the same place at the same time every day. I haven't been able to exactly adhere to that, but I think the bedrock kind of thing of that advice is that writing needs to become a habit, and it's like, my kids play the cello. You can probably see it behind me, and it's kind of like that. Like, if they don't play for a few days, they lose that muscle memory. And I think the imagination is the same thing. So when I'm in a story or a novel, I just stay in it, and I'll write for a set amount of time every day, or I have a, I know people do that differently. I have a word count every day. So I have to get to 500 words a day before I stop. And it's the habit that will keep you and sustain you and keep you going, especially for something as long as a novel. Because if you write 500 a day, by the end of the year, you have a first draft, right? Um, and as far as what my students teach me, I think one thing that teaching does is it keeps me connected to the wonder of watching people sort of discover their voices. And it keeps me, it refreshes that in me, because when I ask them to commit to experiments, I give them a lot of in class exercises, and sometimes I actually write with them. I don't tell them that's what I'm doing, but I just write with them because I want to be connected to that again, the same way they are. I feel like after a while as a writer, um, and this is not the best thing, but I feel like we get wed to our voices, and we get wed to the techniques we're using, and even just habits of language. And I love that I get to tell them to do something new, and then I have to make myself do it as well. And it always comes out in my writing the next day, whatever I've made myself kind of learn anew.
That's wonderful that you learn from your students and offer them your wisdom as well. Um, so, where can people find you on social media, website?
Sure. I'm on Instagram as Jacinda Townsend, the writer. There were a number of Jacinda Townsends, apparently, but Instagram is Jacinda Townsend, the writer. I'm on Twitter as Jacinda Townsend, and I'm on Facebook as Jacinda Townsend as well.
And now you are on Fireside as Jacinda. So you can click on her icon and follow her so that anytime she comes back to Fireside, and I hope you do come back, you'll get notice of her. We are on it weekly as well, interviewing authors and chatting with them. So you can follow me as well and get notice of those upcoming events. So, is there anything else that before we close out that we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention, talk about? Anything you have in store for you besides what you're working on next, or?
Um, sure. Well, I just want to say about Mother Country that, I hope if you read it, you enjoy the journey of it, because I think it is not only a geographic journey, through all these different places. But for each of these characters, it's very much a spiritual journey. And the end, I think it's a little ragged and it's a little raw, but it's definitely the end of a journey. So I hope you all enjoy it. And it was really, really lovely to meet you, Susan, and really lovely to meet all of you virtually in the audience. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, and we enjoyed having you. And just one last reminder, the fortune cookie in the middle of your screen tells you where you can get a copy of Mother Country on our website, adventuresbythebook.com, or from your favorite bookseller. But just, pick up a copy, because you've heard all that went into it, her passion, her wanting to connect people and make the world a better place. I think that's a beautiful message, from any author, any book. So we appreciate that. We also want to thank everybody in our virtual audience, as well as those tuning in on our public profile page and our social media channels. Thank you, everybody. Jacinda, it's been a pleasure. And I hope we get to chat again and someday maybe even meet in person for a live adventure by the book. But until next time, ask yourself this question: what is your next adventure by the book? Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.